Hi, my name's David Kowalik from Godwit Ministries, and today we're going to be looking at the subject of predestination. You may have been predestined to watch this very video. Now, in my early years, when I first became a believer, I was discipled within a Calvinistic church and naturally came to understand the gospel with a Calvinistic bent. You know, mind you, back in the 1980s, if you just happened to be a thinking person, a Calvinistic system of belief did at least offer you some kind of coherent logic and intellectual satisfaction that many of the other denominations at the time did not. Nevertheless, there were some persistent anomalies and inherent contradictions that troubled my young mind. But whenever I questioned the prevailing narrative, my concerns were dismissed with appeals to the authority of the great Reformation theologians such as Calvin and Luther. After all, who was I to question them? But of particular concern was the Calvinistic teaching surrounding the subject of predestination. Here it was put to me that salvation was a predesignated conclusion based on the sovereignty of God and His grace to those that He had chosen for salvation over and against those who were fated for destruction. Now, whenever I preached with this kind of logic, I invoked literal nightmares in some of my hearers. And I thought to myself, surely the gospel was not meant to invoke this kind of response in those who believed. Now, without the internet, it was difficult to truly compare the claims of Calvinism with the alternatives offered by, say, the Eastern Orthodox churches or the Roman Catholics or 1,000 other possibilities besides. Now, Romans 9, the whole chapter of Romans 9, is one of the passages in Scripture that is often cited by Calvinist teachers to bolster their argument for this kind of predestination that I've just described. In it, Paul uses two examples of people that God predestined to be significant actors in the drama of God's redeeming work. The first example is that of God choosing Jacob over Esau, and the second is the drama of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. I've already uploaded a video on Jacob and Esau, which you can find in a link in the description below. But let's just recap what Paul writes about this subject in Romans 9, 1-16. This is where Paul refers to the story of God choosing Jacob, the younger brother, over Esau, the older brother. Paul here explains that Jacob was chosen even before he was born, even before he had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but on him who calls. That's all in Romans 9, 11-12. In other words, God chose the lesser of the brothers, even before they had any record of merit, to make the point that it does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but entirely on God's mercy. That's Romans 9, verse 16. So this all points to the truth that God's purpose in election is not so much concerned with personal and individual salvation as it is with God's choice of who will bear witness to the promise made to Abraham in a way that will demonstrate that mercy has everything to do with God's faithfulness and nothing to do with human merit. Unfortunately, this same passage is often cited to argue for a cold, hard-edged predetermination by God concerning which individuals would ultimately be saved or destroyed. But this is not the tone or the intent of this passage at all. What Paul is attempting to do here is to make it perfectly clear that God's mercy is utterly free and cannot be constrained or influenced by human will, and thus the election of Jacob was not for his personal salvation. Rather, he was elected for the purpose of conveying the message and the genetics of Abraham's line in such a way that God's grace would be on display over and above the merit of human beings. It's also worth mentioning here that Esau was not being slated for damnation. He simply was not going to be chosen for the task that Jacob was being chosen for. Now, you can scale this all up from Jacob and rightly say that all of Jacob's descendants are called to be a kind of a priest nation to all the other nations and to bear testimony to the faithfulness of God to his covenant. Now, does that mean that all the individual descendants of Jacob are saved? Well, no, obviously not. Election and predestination is not about individual salvation. Instead, it's about the roles that each person or nation or culture is called to play in the outworking of history and God's big plan for the entire world. So then if we go back to Romans 9, Paul goes on to cover the story of God hardening the heart of Pharaoh. Now, this story is also often trotted out as an example by Calvinists to underscore the idea of a fatalistic predetermination on the part of God. It's almost as if we're just mindless pawns on the arbitrary chessboard of life. I once heard about a Calvinist who fell down some stairs and broke both his legs. And when he got to the bottom, he said, well, thank goodness that bit's over. But of course, that's not how we're meant to understand predestination. God is not micromanaging everyone's life. But even this story of Pharaoh is not about individual salvation or damnation. The point here is that the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham is entirely out of human hands, positively or negatively. Human merit cannot channel the mercy of God, bending and dictating where it will flow, but just as importantly, human opposition cannot stop the mercy of God, blocking and checking where it will go. God is sovereign in the sense that he is utterly free from outside influence concerning his mercy, and nothing and nobody can change that. So all Paul is saying here is that we cannot manipulate the mercy of God. God is utterly free from any outside influence concerning his mercy, and nothing and no one can intervene. Not even Pharaoh, who at that time was the most powerful person on earth. Now in verse 17 it goes on to say, I raised you up for this very purpose, that my power might be displayed through you, and that my name might be proclaimed. Now you've got to admit that that worked, because here we are 3,300 years later and we're still talking about it. Now that's no accident. I like the way that Peterson puts it in the Message when he writes, I picked you as a bit player in this drama of my salvation power. All we're saying is that God has the first word, initiating the action in which we play our part for good or for ill. End quote. Now notice how he puts it though, for good or for ill, and I think that's an important descriptor right there. So Paul is not saying that Pharaoh was fated to have a negative experience. Pharaoh was, however, going to be involved, but whether for good or for ill was entirely in Pharaoh's hands. Now let me illustrate what I'm saying here. Some years ago in my hometown here in Adelaide, a so-called prophet came to town and took to the public airways to prophetically predict that a tsunami would wipe out the seaside suburbs of the city on a certain specific date. Now, the then Premier of South Australia, Don Dunstan, took exception to this guy and classed him as a fraud, and publicly said he'd go to the beach on the day that the tsunami was predicted to occur as a way of discrediting this guy. Fair enough, the guy making the prediction had no credibility and was exposed as the fraud that the Premier rightly discerned him to be. But let's change this story up a bit, and let's imagine that the warning story did come from a credible prophet whose previous prognostications had actually come to pass. Then the story would have been entirely different. The Premier would have a choice to be a hero by, clearing out the suburbs that might be affected, or he ends up being drowned, one or the other. Either way, the Premier would have underscored the prophet's credentials, either negatively or positively. If we look at this story of Pharaoh in the same way as that, we begin to get what's really going on. So if you look a little bit more closely, you'll discover that the story is a little bit more textured than the Calvinists would say. Now, if you read the backstory in Exodus, it goes something like this. Let's have a little look at the lead up to this story. The Israelites had gone into Egypt when Joseph was the prime minister. They grew strong, their population soared, and then a new Pharaoh came along who did not know Joseph, and he was afraid of the Israelites. He had some kind of xenophobic attachment to them. And so he had them enslaved. Now Moses was sent as the prophet of God to command him to let my people go. Now on 3 occasions when Moses spoke to Pharaoh, he hardened his own heart. Now so Moses went to Pharaoh, and on 3 occasions he warned him, and then the very things he warned him would happen, happened. And on each occasion, Pharaoh said that he would let the people go, but then he changed his mind, he hardened his own heart. So on 3 occasions, the warning came, The warning was fulfilled, the prophecy came true, but Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Now God, as the director of this drama, had to use some creative license and make his point working with the material that he had at hand. And in this case, Pharaoh was a hardened heart. Now, interestingly, if you read this passage in Romans chapter 9, you'll notice that Paul uses here an analogy of God as a potter. Now, almost certainly, Paul is drawing on Jeremiah 18 here to make this point. Let me read to you some of Jeremiah 18, and starting at verse 2. Up on your feet, go to the potter's house. When you get there, I'll tell you what I have to say. So I went to the potter's house, and sure enough, the potter was there, working away at the wheel. Whenever the potter was working on turned out badly, as sometimes happens when you're working with clay, the potter would simply start over and use the same clay to make another pot. Then God's message came to me. Can't I do just as this potter does with the people of Israel? God's decree, watch this potter. In the same way that this potter works his clay, I work on you, people of Israel. At any moment, I may decide to pull up a people or a country by the roots and get rid of them. But if they repent of their wicked ways, I will think twice and start over with them. At another time, I might decide to plant a people or country. But if they don't cooperate and won't listen to me, I will think again and give up on the plans I had made for them. So what we learn from this is that if the clay is pliable, it can be made into something beautiful and graceful. However, if the clay is unmanageable, then it can only be worked into something crude and lowly. Now, Pharaoh chose the second of these two options and soon discovered that interfering with the plans of God is not a great way to live. So what does this mean for us? Well, God has a plan. He always has. And He has predestined this plan. He's always been at work to fulfill His promises, those promises that He made to Abraham, that through his bloodline a Messiah will arise who will be the King of the Jews, and through them become King of the world, Jesus, who is the Christ. That's really the gospel, the center of the gospel right there. Jesus the Christ, who is the last and best hope of all humanity, and no one can control this or intervene or contradict what God is about. Now, if we are humble and pliable in the hands of God, we can be crafted into something beautiful. But if we're rebellious and resistant and stubborn, we can only be crafted into some crude vessel. So predestination is not a fixed fate. Sure, you cannot choose the role that you play in the drama of redemption, but you can choose to make your role a blessing. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe and to share this video with as many people as you can. Bye for now.